the Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto, Canada. In the lobby of the hospital is a large composite photo. These are the women of the Ezra Snosham Society, who in 1923 founded the original hospital. Down in the right-hand corner is my grandmother, Baba Celia, my father's mother, for whom I'm named. My father's family immigrated to Canada between the years 1900 and 1905 from a small shtetl called Sharashova in White Russia, now known as Belarus. My grandfather Aaron came to St. John, New Brunswick in 1902 to work with his brother-in-law, who owned a tailoring shop. My father Max, age 13, and his sister Dora, 15, followed on their own a year later. In 1905, my Baba Celia and her remaining 3 little boys, Tom, Harry, and Sydney, left Sharashova to join the family in Canada. My father, who was 55 years older than me, didn't tell me much about his early life in Russia. He was a very quiet man, and I didn't know enough to ask more questions. As I grew older, I often wondered whether Sharashova still existed. Had it survived the war? Left behind the Iron Curtain, the little village was for me a place shrouded in memory and mystery. The early 1990s ushered in great changes in the world. It was the period of glasnost, which culminated in the breakup of the Soviet Union. Fortunately for us, my cousin Ian Watson was working in Moscow at the time. As a little boy, he had always been fascinated by genealogy, and at his first opportunity, he took a train to Minsk, then to Brest, and in a taxi, he found the little shtetl of Sharashova, or Sharashova, as it is called in Belarusian. The little village was still there. In 2000, Ian, his parents Leah and Jim, and I visited Sharashova. We arrived from Warsaw on June 21st. It was the most astonishing and amazing experience. It was as if we had gone back in time 100 years. The buildings were all made of wood and were seemingly untouched. The streets were unpaved, and the village looked exactly like a painting by Chagall. Before the war, approximately 1,600 people in the village were Jewish. What had happened to the Jews who had comprised half of the village's population and even had their own mayor? In 1942, the Nazis marched the Jews of Sharashova to a ghetto in the nearby town of Pruzheny, 19 kilometers away. A year later, over a period of 4 days, between January the 31st and February the 2nd, 1943, they were all transported to Auschwitz. There were only a handful of survivors after the war. By the early 1990s, there were only 3 Jewish survivors still living in Sharashova, and they died before the end of the decade. During our visit to Sharashova, I wanted to visit the Jewish cemetery. My great-grandparents and my father's baby sister were buried there. The cemetery was in such a state that although I was standing next to it, I could not recognize it. It had been totally abandoned, and it looked like a field with rocks in it. The cemetery had been there since the 17th century and was the size of a large city block. One could see some monuments, partially submerged and overgrown, and some tipped over on the ground, revealing the weathered Hebrew inscriptions. I thought of all the souls who were resting there and how totally alone they seemed now. No one ever came to visit. No one ever came to pay their respects. It was the local Roman Catholic priest who told us that he wished someone would put a fence around the Jewish cemetery. It was the beginning of an idea. In 2005, I returned to Belarus, this time with a group of North American and Israeli Jews. At that time, I met Franklin Schwartz, an Anglo-American who was living in Minsk and who ran a charitable foundation called Voluntas. I asked Franklin if it would be possible to erect a fence around the cemetery in Sharashova, and he said that he would help me. Franklin put me in touch with Dr. Michael Lozman, an American orthodontist who had been, over the last few years, restoring Jewish cemeteries in Eastern Europe. he had restored 6 cemeteries up to that point, mostly with the participation of American college students. Michael and I agreed to collaborate, with Franklin assisting in Belarus. Franklin traveled to Sharashova, had the cemetery measured, acquired the necessary government permits, and ordered a metal fence to be fabricated at a local foundry. In September 2007, my husband Robert Bell and I, Michael and Franklin, and our interpreter and guide, Konstantin Kadika, rendezvoused in Minsk and proceeded to make our way to Sharashova.